we're going to go ahead and kind of do a world tour through Exhibit A. And we're going to talk about some of the substantive changes in Exhibit A that we especially want applicants to attend to when they're thinking about this program. Now, for those of you who have never worked with our program before, we would encourage you to contact our help desk and to have a discussion about any of the underlying tenets of the program. We're going to try to focus specifically here on major changes that we want applicants to be aware of with respect to this NOFA as compared to prior NOFAs. And a lot of these changes, as I mentioned, House File 848 imposed this new set of requirements onto the program. And so Exhibit A is reflective of those changes. And so what we're trying to do as we go through this is kind of highlight for you some of those things and what the implications may be for applicants. Now, for those of you who have downloaded Exhibit A, you're of course more than welcome to follow along. And again, Exhibit A and all of the associated exhibits that accompany the program are posted on our website, so you can certainly go out there and download them at your convenience. This NOFA is structured in a very similar manner to all the rest of the NOFAs. So the major components that we ordinarily you would ordinarily see in a NOFA, you're going to see here. Here's a link to where we will publish Broadband Availability Map version 4. And again, that will be published on July 1st, which is the same day that the new program will be made available online. So on July 1st, you'll have both the application acceptance window opening and the map available to you. Now, we always have a purpose section in the NOFA. And again, this is a $97.5 million opportunity. And the funds, one of the things that House File 848 did that I didn't mention was it established a requirement for a reservation. 20% of total funds are to be reserved for projects that serve difficult to serve areas. And those are defined for our purposes and in rule for this round as Tier 1 targeted service areas. So 20% of the funds are reserved for that purpose. 80% of the funds are then available to projects that serve Tier 2 and Tier 3 projects, either at the 100-100 level or the 120 level. And this initial paragraph here, sections 1.1 and 1.1.2, just set forth what those reservations are. That's a difference from this time, and we'll go through and assign those reservations as we complete the scoring through the program. There are key definitions here. I'm not going to go through those. They are not materially different, except as you can see, we're changing some of the speeds. So whereas before build-out speed was 25.3, now we're looking at 100-100 or 120, so we need to take the opportunity to define those things. We have allowable expenditures, and they really are the same as they have been in the past. We have had questions over the years about the inclusion of pre-NOFA issuance purchased inventory, and so we wanted to call that out directly as applicable, as allowable under this program. So you'll see maybe a more direct statement about pre-issuance date inventory items than you've seen in the past. But the rest of this is very similar to what you've seen before if you've worked with the program, the expenditures that are allowable. I mentioned the broadband availability map, so I will scoot through that. Again, you may hear us referring this to a broadband unit or a homeschool or business, also an HSB. Homes, schools, and businesses are how we measure the number of end users to whom service will be facilitated. So you'll see that concept throughout the program. And here are the tier definitions that I mentioned. So to the individual who asked me to sort of fumble through the tier definitions, here they are set forth in section 129. So I would encourage you to take a look at that, because those will be especially important as we go through some of the tenets of the program. For convenience and simplicity, we're also doing some definitional things that just for your convenience and ours. The way the House File 848 was written is a little, it's not especially convenient to use some of those terminology in a NOFA. And so a targeted service area within which Tier 1 speeds are identified as a Tier 1 TSA. So a Tier 2 TSA and a Tier 3 TSA. So we're doing some definitional things here to try to make things easier for you. When I say a Tier 3 TSA, or one of our staff do, or the NOFA does, we mean a targeted service area within which broadband speeds do not exceed Tier 3 levels. So that's just something to keep in mind. Project period and contract terms are set forth here, and there's a schedule of important dates below that I'll go through. Concerning eligibility and the question that we got earlier about who may apply, this is where you'll see some of the requirements concerning eligibility. And in addition to the type of organization you are, there are, obviously other requirements about the type of build out you do, that it's delivering broadband within Iowa, those sorts of things. Now, we have gotten some questions about project completion dates, and here we're constrained by the availability of the funds. So the office has not sought in this NOFA to condense the project schedule further, with one small exception. The funds that were granted to the office, that $100 million, are available until June 30th of 2025. We're asking the projects be completed by April 30th of 2025. And the reason for that is we need a couple of months to be able to process claims and get all that money paid out before the end of the fiscal year. Excuse me. So that's the reason for the April 30th, 2025 date. But I just wanted to call your attention to that since we have had a couple of questions in that regard. We're going to go through the core application, which is really where you're going to identify your project here in a little bit. Core application, again, is a spreadsheet where you'll put in the census blocks and the speed levels and the budget and all that other information that's necessary to define the scope of your project. And we've got some information about total project cost that builds upon the allowable expenditures comments. Again, budgets are defined in the core application and then again in the Iowa grant system. So we'll talk about that a little bit. Now, just as in prior NOFAs, we have inside TSA infrastructure costs and outside TSA infrastructure costs. And so inside TSA infrastructure costs are going to be defined in Exhibit D of the core application. That's where you're going to take all of the items in your budget that are related to components that are being installed geographically within targeted service areas, and you're going to identify those. Now, there may be circumstances where to deliver your project, you need to make investments that are geographically outside of targeted service areas. And in those circumstances, we provide a second worksheet, which is called Exhibit D. Exhibit D1. And that worksheet is where you identify the outside TSA infrastructure investments that you're going to make. And that could be, for example, maybe you're going to install a tower and an antenna for the purpose of broadcasting service into targeted service areas, but the tower itself and the antenna are physically, geographically in a non-TSA. If that were the case, your project would still be eligible. You just need to identify that that investment is not geographically within a targeted service area, and you would do that in Exhibit D1. And there's some other things that you're required to set forth there in D1. That's the exact same process as we've had in all prior 5 NOFAs from this one. Again, the available funds are $97,500,000. And here are the matching levels that I talked about earlier. So 75% match of state funds is available for 100/100 broadband installed in Tier 1 TSAs, 50% match for Tier 2 TSAs, 35% match for Tier 3 TSAs. And here's that carve out I mentioned where 50% match is available for 120 installation, but only within Tier 1 TSAs. So one of the complexities here is we have this notion of a maximum funding request, and this is new in this grant cycle, and so I wanted to call your attention to it. Now, we've been through the tiers, and hopefully, I mean, that may still be fuzzy, but hopefully after you read it and you think about it a little more, that'll become clear. So you have these different tiers, and they have different matching levels. And then we have 2 different types of build-out speeds. So there's a few different things for us to consider based on the design of the legislation. And it kind of turns into a matrix for how to calculate the maximum amount of funds that are available to an applicant based on the project that they define. The simplest calculations, and by no means do you have to build a project this way. I want to be super clear on that. It's just, I want to start with the simplest way to calculate maximum funding request, and then we'll work into a more complex example. But the simplest is your project is 100% Tier 1 TSAs, or 100% Tier 2 TSAs, or 100% Tier 3 TSAs. In those circumstances, if your project is 100% Tier 1 TSAs, you're going to get 75% match of whatever's in your budget. It's just a straight line 75%. If If you're 100% tier 1, 75%. If you're 100% tier 2, 50%. If you're 100% tier 3, 35%. So that's sort of, I think the easiest way I can think to explain it is just straight line, simple calculations. But all of the blocks in those examples are of the same tier. All the blocks are tier 1, all the blocks are tier 2, all the blocks are tier 3. Now, what we expect to see, because projects aren't built around census blocks, is a mix. We expect to see a project and encourage you to submit projects that include some tier 1s and some tier 2s and some tier 3s. Whatever project that makes the economic sense for you to build, and that's what we want you to submit. We don't want you to have to do some crazy combination of different applications in order to make this work. In that circumstance where we have a project that's across a heterogeneous mix of tier types, then we have to calculate the maximum funding request differently, because some blocks are going to be reimbursed at 75%, the tier 1 blocks that are part of your project. Some blocks are going to be reimbursed at 50%, and some blocks are going to be reimbursed at 35%. So we have to come up with a different mechanism to do that. And the maximum funding request formula set forth here is that mechanism. And so you can see one thing that I want to call your attention to, because we did get a number of comments about this in the past, is we've pivoted from counting census blocks to counting square miles, so as to try to take into consideration the geographic size of the areas that you're dealing with. And so in all the formulas that you see here, we've moved to square mileage based calculations and away from counts of census blocks. So we create a formula like the one that's described here that creates a blended match rate based on the combination of blocks that you bring to bear in your project. And so that's how maximum funding request is calculated for those types of projects. And then, of course, we have that example where you could build out 120 if you wish, only in tier 1 TSAs. And again, that also is calculated differently under the legislation. And that's at 50% of your total project costs. So as you go through the design of the program, the application process, you'll see the core application spreadsheet calculate for you these maximum percentages, so you can get a sense of what the maximum funding request could be right away when you load your census blocks in. The 20% reservation that I mentioned earlier is set here for difficult to serve areas. And again, those are tier 1 areas. So that's what that's doing. We routinely, and many of you are familiar with the project, have to calculate partial award amounts. That can happen in circumstances where 2 applicants are overlapping the same project area. They're both requesting funds for the same area, or a prior state incentive was issued for that block, but the build out's not yet completed. And so we have to figure out a way to adjust an award for those circumstances. And all that this is doing is it's essentially the same calculation as has always been applied by the office. But in this case, it's going to look at square mileage again instead of counts of census blocks. So that's what's happening there. And we have some examples of when the office would do partial awards for overlap and in what circumstances that you can read. But really, you don't necessarily have to be thinking about any of this on the front end of the application. It's just explanatory as to how the office will calculate an award for you in a circumstance where another applicant is applying in the same area that you are. Some other language. So we do have some limitations on prior applications. So one thing that's a little different this time is, those of you who've been through the program with us, we've had an evolution of build out speed levels. So the earliest grants would have been for build out at 25.3, and then it's gone up from there. And so if we awarded a grant in the past for 25.3 build out, we're not going to excise that from this program like we would have in other circumstances. Rather, we're going to say that 25.3 build out would just move this from a tier 1 to a tier 2 block, but that block remains eligible for faster build out speeds because the applicant didn't build out to 100 at that time. They built out to 25.3. Now that's a different case than if the applicant did build out to 100, and then we look at that circumstance differently and do a partial deduction based on that. So there's some complicated logistics that are happening here, but I just wanted to make sure you were aware that we will be looking at prior incentive overlap differently than we have in the past, with consideration for the build out speeds that were awarded in the past. And part of that is that the Empower Rural Iowa program has changed the build out threshold. So we want to keep a block shouldn't be excised just because it received prior build out. It should be excised because it received prior build out at a slower speed than the program would incentivize now. And so it's a little more difficult to wrap your head around, but that's just another thing that's going on there. Let's see. Schedule of important dates is here. This is also published on our website. And you can see all of the dates here. We are right now in the pre-application conference. Tomorrow begins the written question and answer process, where you can start submitting formal questions in writing to the office and get binding answers. And we'll post those on July 1st. And then that'll be the same date as the NOFA issuance, the publication of the broadband map. And we expect to have notices of intent to award issued on or around September 3rd. Let's see. This is all explanation for all those dates up above, and really essentially the same content as you've seen in the past. We announce awards through what's called a Notice of Intent to Award, or NOIA. That'll be published on our website. And we'll also contact winners the day we post the NOIA, so you'll get direct communication from us if you've received an award. That will be followed by the submission to you of a grant agreement by the office. And then you'll be asked to execute that grant agreement within 10 business days of receipt, and that will commence your grant and begin the process for you. Moving on here, just inquiries in general. So in terms of interacting with the office and asking questions, we ask that you always use the OCIO grants at iowa.gov mailbox. It's important that for us, so that we can track your correspondence and make sure that we're getting back to you in a timely way, we can document what your questions are and hopefully work to make the program better in the future. And we want to make sure that we've got, since we have several people working on the program now, that they all have access to that archive and can look at it. So in case one person is out, someone else can step in and help you with your question. So please do route your inquiries through there. There are some grounds for rejection and disqualification. They have always been in here. It's important to pay attention to these as an applicant, because there are circumstances where we may reject an application if it's incomplete or has inaccurate answers or other reasons. And so do review section 1.9 just to get a sense of what that is, to make sure that your application is conforming with those requirements. You may have noticed on the website, with all of the other exhibits that were posted, there is a section there that doesn't have a link yet, called the Grants Management Policies and Procedures Guide. We issue one of those for every NOFA, and that's a guidebook for successful applicants to help them in gathering information and documenting their expenditures in preparation for the submission of a claim. We ask that you read and review that if you do receive an award, and that's the basic mechanism, or describes the mechanisms through which we'll process your claim upon project completion. This section is all about the form and content of applications. And so here you're going to see a general explanation of the forms that you'll be asked to submit. Now, again, the basic structure of the program from an application standpoint begins with the Iowa Grants System. And there is an Iowa Grants Registration and Application Instructions Guide that's posted as Exhibit I that will walk you through step by step with screenshots what's required to click through the steps to submit an application. And here are a list of all of the forms that you'll be asked to address throughout your submission and what those forms do. And I won't read all this to you, but we can certainly answer questions as we go through the process should you have them. One question we did get in Executive Project Summary, there's a note that said the information provided in this form does not inform the scope of the project outlined in the core application. The intended meaning there is to say that executive project summaries are a place for you to describe the project at a high level. But when we get down to nuts and bolts about what the scope of your project is, what you put in the core application is determinative. That describes the census blocks you'll be building in, the number of homes and schools and businesses that you'll be facilitating service to, the speed levels, and so forth. And so when we ask, what is this project all about? And we look at, what your original project submission was and what your claim is, we're going to look at the core application. That's what this is intended to mean. Demonstrated experience, you'll be asked to tell us a little bit about your firm. There's a minority impact statement that all applicants are required to fill out. And then we proceed into a core application, which is an Excel workbook that has several exhibits in it. And we'll go through those exhibits, and momentarily we'll switch over and actually show you the core application and kind of run through what it takes to complete a core application. There is another exhibit that will be coming soon that you may have seen on the website but isn't available yet, and that's the project selection, data export, and import instructions. And that provides guidance for how you go to the map we'll be publishing on July 1st, identify the census blocks that form the basis of your project, and submit those to us as part of the core application. So there's specific guides there. It's very similar to what, if you've been an applicant in the past, it's very similar, same kind of steps and process, but of course we're here to help. If you run into any problems, we have lots of resources available to assist you with project selection if you need help. And you'll be asked to tell us about your funding sources in Exhibit C. And this is where, if you have that federal matching funds, if you're going to use ARP, we want you to identify that here and tell us about it. And then there's opportunity for you to provide your budget and so forth. And there's some other exhibits here that you're expected to fill out that look the same as before. Exhibit G is where you'll request confidential treatment if you would like to have confidential treatment of your application. And then there's an application checklist, and we'll talk a little bit about those before the end of the program. Now, I mentioned scoring changed in House File 848. There were factors that were removed and there were factors that were added. And so our charge is to figure out how to amend the NOFA to reflect those new factors. One other thing we did, sensing that with the higher funding amount, that there may be more applications, we were looking for opportunities to help increase the velocity of our scoring process so that we can get awards out to you faster. And so we're moving some components from a qualitative basis to a quantitative basis. And so the core scoring for the applications will be quantitative, and what you'll see now is just quantitative factors. And I'll touch on the quantitative factors briefly in the interest of time. The first is rurality, which you've seen before. It's essentially a measure of the population density of your project. Efficiency is a measure of how much it costs per home, school, or business to serve. So we're going to look at the number of broadband units you're facilitating divided into the total cost of your project to get an efficiency measure. The total broadband units facilitated is just a measure of how many homes and schools and businesses you intend to serve. Completeness is a measure of whether or not you're serving all of the homes and schools and businesses that we report exist in those blocks. So we'll look and say, if you have a block that has 20 homes in it and you propose only to serve 10, then that's less completeness than someone who would propose to serve all 20. So that's how we measure that. We are looking here at two different factors, though. The first is that factor I mentioned, proportional facilitation. If you're only serving 10 of the 20 homes there, that's where we would measure that. The second is a notion called simultaneous capability, and that's where applicants can receive 20% of the points in this category if they include a letter. And they don't. This isn't a mandatory requirement. It's an optional requirement. You may optionally include this and receive up to 20% of the points in the category. A letter from a professional engineer certifying that you can simultaneously serve all of the broadband units you propose to facilitate service to. We move on then to relative speed. This is where we measure the average upload and download speed of your project as compared to any other project. And then we basically award you a score based on that. Prospective product attributes, this is similar to what you've seen in the past, although we did remove one element. We look at characteristics of your broadband service that you're going to provide: availability, latency, performance credits, hop count, and data caps. Now, we have had some challenges with applicants in the past on hop counts, so we've taken some time to just clarify in this what the intended meaning of hop count is. And what we're really looking for here is, the output of a trace route command to show the number of intermediate routes reported between a customer premise system and a destination server. So on occasion, we will have an applicant who submits a hop count of 0, for instance. And so we just want to make sure that applicants understand that you can't have a hop count of 0. So what we're wanting to do is provide some additional explanatory text around that to help assist you in the development of your applications. Now, if you do have questions about the calculation of a hop count or how to execute the tools that are required to measure that, do please contact us and we'll provide additional assistance for you. Budget composition is the next one, and this is where we're going to look at that two different factors. The first is the state matching funds requested. So if you request the full amount of the maximum funding amount that you're eligible to receive based on that calculation, then you are going to get a certain amount of points. If you request less than that maximum funding amount, for instance, if the maximum funding amount for your project from the state is 68% and you request only 63%, we're going to look at that and provide additional points. So if you need less money than the state maximally will make available to you, there's additional points that are available to you should you be in that circumstance. So if you can get 75%, but you only need 68, more points if that's the circumstances for your application. And the other component in that subcategory is federal, local, or external match. And here we're going to look at those, the introduction of other sources of funds, ARP, RDOF, whatever the case may be. If you have those and you identify them, you're eligible to receive additional points under the program. Then we're going to look at relative needs. So there's two more factors here, and both of these factors have to do with the composition of your project from a tier perspective. In relative need, we're going to look at the existing speeds, and we're going to calculate them in the manner set forth here. So the more tier 1 and tier 2 TSAs you have in your project, the more points you're going to get for relative need. What we're really doing there is saying those are the places that need broadband the most because there's nothing or it's very slow, and so there's more points there. Additionally, you can provide testimonials or letters of community support for which you'll receive additional points. And these testimonials or letter support should come from either anchor institutions or agricultural operations or elected leaders that support your project. And then finally, lastly, again, with the theme that Tier 1 is a critical source of focus here, and specifically related to requirement and statute, we'll be measuring Tier 1 composition. And that looks at the proportion of your project that's made up of Tier 1 TSAs and providing points to you there. If you have a lot of Tier 1 TSAs, you get more points. If you have fewer Tier 1 TSAs, you get less points. Section 4 is just a list of the attachments that accompany the application. Exhibit A is what we're going through right now. Core application will be transitioning to next. Grant agreements are set forth in Exhibit E, and you have all of these on the website so you can look at them. Exhibit F is where we ask you some information about your business and ask you to certify that you're capable of meeting the requirements of the program. Exhibit G, confidential treatment form. There's an application checklist you do not have to submit. I mentioned the Iowa Grants application and registration instructions, and of course we're here to provide assistance should you have questions about how to use that system. And then Exhibit I, project data selection, data import instructions. And there'll also be, as I mentioned, the process for claims, that additional sort of compendium to deal with the claims process that we'll be publishing after the application window opens. Again, July 1st, broadband availability map will be published. This is the link to the landing page for Notice of Funding Availability 6. If you have not subscribed to our listserv, I would encourage you to do that so you can get updates from us. Should there need to be any amendments to the NOFA or any changes or other updates, we'll be providing those via that mechanism. So that's the place to really sign up and make sure you get the most up-to-date information. And all of the extended terms, which I'm not going to take you through here, are in the glossary. In addition, there's some other terms and conditions here, which are for the lawyers to review. If they have not, make sure you understand what these are, but they're essentially the same provisions that you've seen in prior NOFAs. So